Good evening, Dr. Soin.
Hi, good evening, Pallavi. Hi,
Most
Sanjeev.
welcome.
Hi, good evening, Avi. Good evening, Dr. Soin.
So let me introduce you, Dr. Soin. Not that you need much of an introduction, as most of the people listening to us will know, Dr. Soin is a pioneer in liver transplantation and currently the chairman of the Institute of Liver Transplantation and Regenerative Medicine at Medanta, the Medicity. Um, Dr. Soin was awarded the Padma Shri in the year 2010 by the President of India for his contributions to the field of medicine. So between Dr. Soin and Dr. Saigal, I don't think we could have asked for better, more expert opinion on liver. And so we were talking, Dr. Soin, about fatty liver and how obesity is linked to liver diseases. I would like to ask you, Dr. Soin, now that you've joined us, how do you begin to, what are the symptoms that you have to look out for to know that there is some issue with the liver, that you're developing some liver problems? What is it that the general public needs to be alert to?
Before we start talking about symptoms of liver disease, everyone must know that liver is one organ in the body that has an amazing amount of reserve. So until about 50 or 60% liver gets damaged, you may not have any symptoms. And that is why we often get patients who tell us that, Dr. Soin, I was well 3 months ago, and now you suddenly tell me that I have 60% or 70% liver damage. Well, that is always the case, because when you have 40% or 50% liver damage, you're not going to manifest, you're not going to show anything. I mean, nothing's going to, you're not actually going to face any problems. So that's why the initial symptoms of liver disease are very non-specific, like generalized tiredness, feeling a little fatigued. You may actually, your hemoglobin may come down, so you may feel more tired. If you do blood tests for some other reason, that's when you may find out that you have something wrong with you. So initial symptoms are non-specific. But when the liver disease advances to about 65, 70% or 75% liver damage, then one gets symptoms and signs which are specific to liver disease, which means somebody's bilirubin level may rise, so they get jaundiced. If the bilirubin level in the blood is beyond 2.5, then yellowness in the eyes starts to show up, and the stools may become more pale colored, and then urine may become more yellow. So that's when you say that you have jaundice. So jaundice is one of the symptoms. Then you may start to get puffy eyes, you may start to get fluid retention in your feet, which we call pedal edema or swollen feet. And then sometimes this even manifests as water in the tummy, or so-called ascites. Now, why does that happen? That happens because one of the 500 functions of the liver, I don't know if you've
Yes, we did.
spoken about the functions.
We put it up in our
One of the
flyers.
many functions of the liver is, so one of the many functions of the liver is to regulate the amount of fluid that's retained in the body versus that is excreted through the urine, right? So the hormones that decide that balance of fluid in the body are made in the liver, as most of the other hormones are also. So when the liver is not functioning well, you tend to retain fluid in the body, and that manifests as water in the tummy, water in your feet, water in your face. Wherever there's a loose skin, there'll be fluid accumulation. Yeah. So jaundice, water retention, and then if things get really bad, 70%, 75% liver damage, then what happens is that liver becomes very hard. So you don't get normal blood circulation to go through the liver, and in which case the blood sort of gets dammed up in the intestine, because normally blood from the intestine goes to the liver. So it gets pent up in the liver, in the intestine and the stomach, and that makes for what we call varices. So there are swollen blood vessels in the stomach, in the food pipe, and in the intestine, and they may bleed. So bleeding in the vomit is another symptom. I'm kind of trying to explain to you why everything happens.
Yeah.
So jaundice, water retention, and then bleeding either in the vomit or black colored stools, because by the time the red blood gets down to the bottom and you pass it out in the stool, it actually becomes black. So then occasionally you get pre-coma symptoms. Like somebody may be confused, the sleep cycle may change, they may feel sleepy in the day, they may be awake at night, or they may be excessively drowsy. So those are also specific symptoms of liver disease. And why that happens is that toxic products, instead of getting detoxified in the liver, they will reach the brain and they cause confusion and drowsiness. So those could also be symptoms of liver disease.
Thank you so much. You mentioned jaundice, Dr. Soin. I just want you to help the audience understand what does it mean and how much chances are there for a jaundice to lead to liver failure.
So jaundice is not a cause of liver failure. It's a manifestation. It's a symptom of liver failure. So the causes, I think Dr. Sehgal may have touched upon earlier. Sanjeev, have you?
I haven't discussed the causes in details.
Okay, maybe. So I'll just quickly say the causes, and then Dr. Sanjeev Sehgal, of course, is the expert who makes sure that none of these causes lead to liver failure, so that Dr. Soin's surgery is not needed. So, so, so the main causes of liver disease are hepatitis B, hepatitis C, alcohol, and the latest and the most important cause is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, I believe you may have touched upon.
I just touched on the NFL part. That's right.
Yeah. So let's not make a mistake. Jaundice is not a cause of liver failure. It's a manifestation of liver failure. It just tells you that liver failure is happening, or liver is on its way to getting damaged more and more.
But a lot of us have had jaundice, which doesn't necessarily would have led to liver failure.
Yeah. Jaundice can happen because of many reasons. And jaundice is a common symptom of liver disease of any kind. The commonest so-called jaundice that gets better in 10, 15 days, 20 days is because of viral infection with a virus called hepatitis A or hepatitis E, both of which are viruses that are transmitted through infected water and or food. So that's what we call fecal-oral transmission, which basically means that they get excreted in the feces, and they get passed from then of course there's contaminated water or food, and that's how you acquire it, and that affects the liver. And usually there is inflammation of the liver, jaundice, the liver tests go bad, and usually in 2 to 3 weeks this subsides. So in 97, 98% of the cases, the end result of hepatitis A and or E is that there is transient liver disease that gets better, and then usually it does not happen again. Okay. So if you remember that in your childhood, you may have had an episode of jaundice, this is what it is. Oh. And later in life, this has no bearing on chronic damage or liver cancer or liver failure. But the other kinds of viruses, which I just talked about, hepatitis B or C, those are the bad ones. Those are the nasty ones. They result in chronic damage.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. So you mentioned about non-alcoholic liver disease, but I think a lot of our audience would be interested in what alcohol does to us, because I think asking us to give up alcohol would be a bit of a big ask. So Dr. Sehgal, I would like to help you understand, help us to understand. So we are dealing with a major alcohol addiction globally and very much in our country. Help us understand its effect on liver, and what is your advice? And between the two of you, also tell us what is a safe amount of alcohol that you can consume each day happily without worrying about liver failure.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This is something which is very important. And alcohol-related liver disease is an entity which is still, among the top cause of liver disease in the country. Despite, all the information in social media and all, this has not come down. The number of hepatitis C cases, hepatitis B, they're actually coming down. But alcohol-related liver disease is not coming down. Now, what alcohol does to the liver? Now, let me tell you, not all alcoholics will have a liver problem. It's for, a given 10-20% patients who are heavy chronic drinkers will have liver damage. And this damage initially starts as fatty liver. Now, this fatty liver is something which is very common. The liver gets swollen, and the liver test then may slightly become deranged. And the patient may otherwise be fine. He just comes to doctor and says, "Doctor, I drink." Now, there are two parts to it. One is the physical dependence, and the physical problems are the psychological limitations. Now, a person may have both, may have only one, but the fact is that once liver damage starts happening, there's a stepwise progression. So it is a fatty liver in the earlier part, then it leads to a stage of steatohepatitis, that is alcohol-related liver inflammation. So liver is not only swollen, it is also inflamed. And then there's a third stage, it's called alcoholic cirrhosis, where the liver actually from being swollen, it then starts shrinking. And at this moment, you will find that the patient has got all the symptoms which Dr. Soin was mentioning a little while back. They have got yellow eyes, water in the tummy, they may have blood vomiting, water syndrome, and so on. There's a mid stage when the patient will have an alcoholic hepatitis. This is one of the most serious conditions. This is a patient who's been having alcohol every day, binge drinking, and then they come to you, they have deep jaundice, they have fever, they have loss of appetite, they have profound, muscle wasting, they have, some tummy distension because of water in the tummy, swollen feet. And this is a very, very difficult stage to manage. And actually, if patients are alerted well in time, then number one, they should not reach this stage. And if they reach this stage, then the outcome is actually not good. There's an impact of alcohol damage initially on the liver, but this damage in the liver has an impact on other organs of the body. So there is a collateral damage to the kidney, to the lungs, to the brain. So it is mostly an liver failure and then damage to other organs, right? Then we what is called as a multi-organ liver failure. So this alcohol-induced liver disease presents in all spectrums in our country. We see in our clinics in different stages patient come to us, and I'm sad to say that it is still among the top 4 causes of liver failure leading to liver transplant in our setup. All the newer diseases are coming, things are changing,
but this
but
remains
in my
continuous.
opinion, yes, I mean, Dr. Soin also, he's been doing this, and this transplant and all, and we really feel bad when patients have liver failure because of alcohol-related liver damage, and
then also related dilemmas, Dr. Soin, about giving such a person a transplant.
It's a huge discussion separately.
Yeah, huge discussions on that. Yeah.
So why?
So you see, what happens is that it's a kind of a disease. To be honest, alcohol addiction is obviously a disease. It's acknowledged as such. It's acknowledged in the official classification of diseases, and there are specific groups and treatments available for de-addiction. So we all know that. But when they come to us for transplant, there is also a high degree of incidence of dysfunctional families in such situations. So they have other psychosocial issues attached, and therefore we often find it difficult for the families of people who have alcoholic liver cirrhosis to come forward for donation. That's one of the problems. And the other is, of course, when you're allocating a deceased donor organ, that's
so much more bigger responsibility.
Yeah. So organ that is retrieved from a person who's become brain dead. So such organs may be preferentially allocated to non-alcoholic cirrhotic patients, because it is thought by majority of the transplant community that they have brought this upon themselves, so they don't deserve an organ from the society. The other people deserve it in preference. That's the other problem. So there are a lot of other
whole new area of discussion.
Yes.
We're beginning to get some questions, Dr. Soin and Dr. Sehgal, from the audience. Rasika wants to know, is non-alcoholic liver disease hereditary?
Yes.
So Sanjeev, you want to take that?
Yeah, it's an important question. There is a genetic predisposition to NAFLD also. There are some genetic markers which have been studied, and there is a thought that, if you see some families, you will find that despite not being obese, which I mentioned earlier, they are actually
lean.
Still have NAFLD. And actually, I've seen that sometimes patients come to us, and in one family, we have 3-4 people, mother, the son, the daughter, they all have actually NAFLD. So there is an entity of perhaps genetic component to NAFLD, which can actually get manifested in presence of other phenotypic factors like, lack of exercise and, diabetes, cholesterol problem, and so on.
I mean, there's another aspect to this, which is basically that diabetes can run in families, obesity can run in families, dyslipidemic disorders can run in families, and all these predispose to fatty liver as well.
Yes.
So all the causes of fatty liver, including the lean NASH and genetic causes, can run in families.
And the other question is, can taking statins, I don't know how to pronounce that, bring about liver disease? I don't know what statins are, and maybe a lot of us don't know.
Yeah, okay. Statins are actually medications which are used to lower the cholesterol. It's a broad term. There are different groups, simvastatin, atorvastatin, rosuvastatin, so on, right? So this group of drugs are traditionally, used to lower cholesterol in patients with high cholesterol level. Earlier, there was a thought that statins can cause liver damage. If you take, it's like if you read the drug insert, you'll find that with these statins, there's a warning that the liver enzymes may increase. But now we have seen that if a patient has got a fatty liver disease and has got high cholesterol, in them use of statins is safe. It doesn't really harm the liver, but one has to be cautious. And under the supervision of a doctor, you can take it.
I think this one, Dr. Soin, is for you. Bhau Sahib wants to know what is the longevity of the liver transplant patient?
So we transplant children who are 3 months old, 6 months old,
Yes.
a year old. We transplant them for their whole life. We don't transplant them for 5 years or 10 years. We hope, we expect that they would live their normal life expectancy, whatever's in their destiny, whether it is 60 years or 80 years or 100 years. So we think the liver lasts a lifetime. And that has been our experience. The first child that I transplanted in India was 22 years ago. He was 17 months old at the time. And his father gave 20% of his liver for his transplant. And now he's a doctor. He wants to be a surgeon.
How beautiful is that?
So this is like 22 years on. So, and I worked at Cambridge University, which is one of the centers where the earliest liver transplants were done in the 60s. I mean, I worked there in the 90s. And I looked after several patients who had had transplants 25, 30 years previously. So this is from personal experience. So the simple answer is the entire lifetime.
Bhau Sahib also wants to know the cost of liver transplant in India.
So liver transplant is an expensive procedure per se, because you use all kinds of disposables, which are used only once for the patient. And these alone cost between 5 and 10 lakhs for a case of liver transplant, right? Then you use a lot of blood products, you use a lot of expensive medicines. The whole setup it costs a lot to make. So typically in India, in a private hospital, in a child, it will cost around 16, 17 lakhs. And in an adult, it will cost about 20, 21 lakhs. This is a standard uncomplicated transplant. In a government setup, it may be 3 or 4 lakhs less, but it's certainly not cheaper than that. And this is from personal experience. We actually run the liver transplant program as mentors of a very, very premier government institute. Yes.
Dr. Sumana Naveen wants to know what is the incidence of liver diseases in India?
Okay.
Dr. Sen.
Yeah. See, liver diseases are among the, you can say, commonest diseases, ailments which, encounter in practice, right? Now, if you look at an overall thing, you cannot have a figure like that. But if you say hepatitis B, hepatitis C, all of these have different incidences, different carrier rates. Like hepatitis B, the quantum in the country today is about, I think, 50 to 60 million. And out of this 1.3 billion population, the huge number. I mean, it's like, 2 to 7% is a carrier rate. Hepatitis C, something about 17, 18 million population of the country is hepatitis C positive. Alcoholics, you cannot again quantify because the number of people who take alcohol is huge, and a lot of them will never come to you in the hospital for a checkup.
Yes.
But if you look at a center-specific data or the country-specific data, you'll find that about 20 to 25% of patients who are having liver diseases are coming to a clinic are because of alcohol. In my experience, if you ask me in my OPD, about 30% of patients who come to the OPD are because of alcohol, about 30% will be because of hepatitis B or hepatitis C, and then NAFLD, which has come recently. So this way you can look at a different spectrum. Like NAFLD, I mentioned, I think 10 to 40% of Indian population is having an NAFLD. This is a fatty liver of some sort. So that way, if you combine all of these together, I mean, we have not really spoken of other causes, the drug and toxins causing liver
Yeah.
problems, the metabolic problems, the inherited problems. So if you combine everything together, it's a huge gamut of problems which we're facing today. And I think that, this is among the most important problems which we're facing as medical professionals in the country today.
I hope that answers your question, Dr. Naveen. Sharika wants this question for both Dr. Sehgal and Dr. Soin. Sorry. Please elaborate on reasons for NASL.
I think this is NAFL.
NA must be, it's written NASL, maybe it's a typo.
If
Is
it's
there anything like NASL?
It's NAFL, which is non-alcoholic
Must
fatty
be
liver.
NAFL.
Yeah, what you just mentioned, what you were just talking about.
We discussed that in case.
Yeah. What are the reasons for liver failure in small children?
Okay, so there are two specific categories of diseases that affect children. The most common in very small children is something called biliary atresia. Okay, what happens is that there is 1 in 15,000 incidents of a child having an underdeveloped bile system in their liver. Okay, so so atretic means underdeveloped or not present, right? So biliary atresia means that the biliary tree, it's actually like a tree, it's spread inside the liver, where small branches coalesce to form bigger branches, and then ultimately one bile duct comes out of the liver and the bile goes into the intestine. That's how it is. So this tree is underdeveloped. So the bile gets pent up in the liver and it damages the liver cells, and this is called biliary atresia, leading to cirrhosis. So 60% of the children less than 3 years of age will have liver failure because of biliary atresia. So out of 100 people, 100 kids you see with liver failure, 60 will have biliary atresia. The other common causes are metabolic causes. Metabolic causes means like difficulties in or derangements in copper metabolism, like Wilson's disease. And you have some amino acid disorders. So what happens is the liver normally basically metabolizes fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And the protein cycles are interrupted when certain enzymes in the liver are absent. And they cause accumulation of. So if A has to be converted to B through an enzyme, and that enzyme is absent, then A will accumulate. And they cause excessive amino acids. So those are some other metabolic disorders, and some the liver is spoiled, and some only the other organs get affected. So metabolic diseases and biliary diseases make up the two specific reasons why children have liver failure. Older children will have the same causes like hepatitis B or hepatitis C as the adults may have. They may even have NAFLD, but obviously don't have alcoholic liver disease.
In situations of family reoccurrence of liver disease, which is non-alcoholic, how often should other family members get regular checks, and what kind of monitoring should they be undergoing?
Yeah, Dr. Sehgal, that's $1 million question.
Are you talking? I think you're talking about the family occurrence of NAFLD, right?
Yeah.
See, this is something which is a matter of awareness. There's no special protocol for that. Generally speaking, if somebody has got fatty liver disease in the family, right? As a part of health checkup, what we do is we always advise the members who are, in a younger age group to have a routine, ultrasound and an LFT. But it is not recommended for somebody who's young. There's no advisory that somebody who's on 15 years, 20 years age, young boy, moving around healthy, you check him in the fear that he may have an NAFLD. But nevertheless, this is the time to give a message that in general, you should follow the advices. But if you are not following and somebody in the family has fatty liver, please follow the simple advices of keeping your liver healthy, which would be do exercises regularly.
Watch your diet.
Watch your diet. Avoid fatty food, burgers. Young boys and all these days are actually doing a lot of virtual classes online. They're doing computer stuff and all. But then they are sometimes not going to, I forgot this Corona time. Otherwise, also, they're not just going to the playgrounds.
That's right.
Tell them to go out, so watch your diet and all. And if possible, have a checkup of your blood sugar and all, or cholesterol once in a while. So if you follow these advices, I think this is sufficient. As a change of lifestyle is what is most important at this stage.
Um, this is Jakpreet asking, is fatty liver hereditary? What precautions can one take to avoid it? We did discuss that a little
We've,
bit.
we've kind of discussed that, right?
Obviously.
Already. Yeah.
Hemal wants to know, are the one-time products used in a liver transplant made in India? What can be done to reduce the costs?
So a lot of the one-time products that are used in liver transplantation are made in India, but a lot of them are not,
Okay.
right? So what can be done to reduce the cost of liver transplantation? Well, to a given patient, they can be paid by the employer.
Yeah.
They can they can have insurance, because now insurance covers 15 lakhs, 20 lakhs, 25 lakhs, even 50 lakhs. So people have that kind of cover. So especially, people who have a history of having had liver disease in their family would be well advised to have a significant insurance cover. Then, yes, you're right. By indigenous manufacture of a lot of the products, we could reduce the cost by 10, 20%. And the government could obviously come down on the import duty of the other stuff that we have to get from abroad. So those are the various methods. But, I'd like to tell you something. I did the first ever successful liver transplant in India on the 6th of November, 1998. The family paid 18.5 lakhs. That was 22 years ago. The cost is still about 20, 21 lakhs, right?
There hasn't been
For an uncomplicated case. So everything else, the cost has gone up 3, 4, 5, 6 times. So I'm not saying it is cheap, but inherently it's an expensive procedure, and there is only a degree to which you can reduce the cost.
Reduce the cost. Thank you. There's a question by Jay. I think post-transplant immunosuppressant dosage varies from one doctor to another. Many feel Indian race needs lower dosage, which would also reduce the long-term side effects, which can be excessive. What do you have to say about that?
Interesting. So, Sanjeev, I think you should go.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and which we have experienced over 20 years. Me and Dr. Swan working together in this field. We have seen when I was working in UK, and we were doing disease node transplants, the dosages of the immunosuppression, the tacrolimus and all, were really very high, very stiff doses, and the levels you used in the early transplant period are really high. Gradually, when we started doing the living donor transplant in our country, we found that for various reasons, the dosages being used for our Indian patients are actually much lower. And there were two reasons. One was that maybe the build was small, they're small structured people in general, or that in the living donor transplants, the graft is small, it is, from a family member, it probably needs lesser immunosuppression. And now this has evolved. It's a very nice question, actually. I must compliment the
This was asked by Dr. Mr. Sudhir Devan. He's a liver recipient himself.
Yeah, Devan is a dear friend of mine.
Yes, it was his question. Yeah.
He's very right. So now we have seen that there is a difference in the approach about immunosuppression. So we are doing what is called as minimal immunosuppression. So minimum dosage are needed to maintain the liver healthy. Secondly, the levels of tacrolimus or cyclosporine which are kept are on the lower side. And we have seen that rejection is really not a big issue. It's there for 10, 15% patients. You can always manage it well, and patients can be treated. You don't lose a graft because of that. But what is more problematic is that you give a higher dose of immunosuppression, patient has infections, other complications.
Other complications.
So the fact is, yes, it is true that the dosages which we are using today in our patients, especially the living donor liver transplant patients in Indian setup, are lower than the traditionally recommended doses which are there in the textbooks.
Thank you. This is again an interesting question by Piyush. And so he is obviously in a dilemma because he's trying to do a healthy thing. He wants to know, what is the effect of proteins used for body building on liver? Any recommendation for usage of some protein? So you want him to be healthy. He's trying to do healthy stuff. And now he wants to know what are those proteins doing for him.
So the whey proteins, right?
Yes, I think that's what
okay.
Well, I think they're safe. Sanjeev, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're safe for the liver.
I will tell you right now. We have seen young boys admitted in hospital because of liver failure, and they were taking health supplements from gym. So
no, but proteins are okay.
Yes. Exactly what Dr. Soin is telling. is that proteins are safe, whey protein is safe, which is right. But people actually distort the message, and you go to gyms and they buy
All
these big
kinds of these big jars of
the jars
supplements.
of proteins, which are very expensive, which are
Yeah.
imported usually, and they take these extra proteins for bodybuilding. So protein supplements for a healthy person is, I would not advise. If you're healthy with good diet, you're fine. If you have a disease, if you have a liver problem, something else, you need protein supplements, you must take it. But for bodybuilding, going to gym and all and taking health supplements, that is, I think, something which is risky, because we have seen young boys coming with, liver tests which are deranged, deep jaundice, and they don't tell the history. And after long, poking, you find that he was going to gym and, having those,
Yeah.
like, 7,000-8,000 worth rupees, these protein supplements regularly. I'm not saying that they are bad. If you use it in a regulated way, it will be fine. But unregulated use of protein supplements, and I think healthy people, I mean, really
Don't.
should not have that.
Diet
You
should take
see,
care of
you
it.
see, the problem is that taking steroids for bodybuilding is bad, and a
Yes,
lot of bodybuilders actually resort to steroids, and
Steroids.
that's really unhealthy.
yes,
That's a
If
good takeaway.
somebody has extra protein because you're doing 3 hours of workout and you think your muscles are really big and they need a lot of protein, then as long as it's monitored and a nutritional expert tells you that this is the right sort of health protein to take, whey protein, which is fine, it's okay. But do not supplement your gym routine with steroids. That's the bad part.
yes. That is exactly the right message.
A
Yeah.
great message to take. There's a question by Bhau Saib. I believe he was the first liver transplant recipient of Hyderabad. Is what Lalita tells me. He wants to know: is there any medical school available in India to train hepatic physicians and hepatic surgeons?
I mean, on the medical part, I
Wow.
can tell you, I mean, Dr. Soin will be the right person to answer this, because I think he has to his credit the most number of transplant fellows trained in the country. And I think let him answer the surgical part first.
Okay.
So the answer is yes. We do have formal liver transplant training in surgery, in hepatology, in anesthesia, and critical care. There are these four core specialties of liver transplantation that go hand in hand. When you say the core team of liver transplant, it comprises of these four people. And yes, there are specific training fellowships available in most of the high volume centers and training institutes, including Medanta. Like Sanjeev said, we have um, the honor of having trained more than 200 fellows in transplant surgery, transplant hepatology, and anesthesia and critical care over the last 10 odd years. And most of these people are working gainfully in transplant centers elsewhere or with us.
Even
Now,
in other
transplant
countries, we go
in
out in
other countries,
Nepal and Bangladesh. So many times we hear this.
absolutely right. In several other countries, probably close to 15 other countries.
Amazing.
So now the thing is that in medical school you get to do the basic degree, that's MBBS, and then you have to do specialization on those an anesthesia or surgery or medicine, etc. So that's MD or MS, and then you become a specialist in gastroenterology or hepatology or GI surgery or hepatobiliary surgery, and then comes liver transplantation. So liver transplantation training is not directly related to medical school in the conventional sense. It's related to high volume teaching centers like ours.
Right.
Okay, my question to both of you. I had so many questions that I had to ask, but we didn't expect so many questions from the audience. So both of you have been practicing, several years now. It's practicing in liver disease and transplant. What sort of pathology are you seeing in the last 10 years? Has there been a change in what you saw earlier vis-a-vis what has been happening in the last couple of years?
So let's give a both hepatology and surgical perspective.
Okay.
Sanjeev, you go first.
I start. Okay. Firstly, let me tell you that it's a unique association. Me and Dr. Soin are together for almost 20 years now, and we, gel along very well. And so, what has happened is that, like, you feel like it's a simple one specialty, and surgery, hepatology, it all, like, it just fuses together very well. Now, when we were practicing, I realized that in hepatology part, it's very clear. The original patients used to come in the initial part were mostly because of hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and alcohol. Then the new entry was NAFLD. This happened in the like about later part of last decade, right? So about 10 years from now, maybe 15 years from now, we were not really talking about NFLD much, but from 2010 onwards, we realized that this was an important game changer. And when we analyze our breakup of patients who are needing transplant, we actually did a very good, because you spoke of pathology, so let me bring forward this study. We published a very unique paper of 100 explants and looked at what was the cause of their liver failure when they were not hepatitis B or hepatitis C related.
Oh,
This was published in Human Pathology. And we found that about two-thirds of patients where there was no cause identified, but because of what we call as NAFLD, cryptogenic cirrhosis. So this is the thing I'm trying to convey.
two-thirds of those.
Yes. So when you don't have a diagnosis, in two-thirds of them, it is because of NAFLD, right? So if you look at the pathology part, and the counterpart of it is the clinical, what we do.
Yeah.
So NAFLD has now entered into this field. I feel that hepatitis C is coming down, and because of the excellent antiviral drugs which are having now, the sofosbuvir and all, hepatitis C is likely to come down further, and the peak will be between, the main competition is going to be between hepatitis and between alcohol and NAFLD, with good immunization program of hepatitis B. It takes about 15 to 20 years for a country to have a visible impact of hepatitis B immunization. Like Taiwan and all, they already have this impact, and the B is coming down. In our country, I think we're going to have this impact soon, in the next few years. So essentially, B will come down, C will come down, and we have NAFLD and alcohol as the top contenders. Then we have other entities.
Top contender, and you don't see alcohol coming down, I think.
Well, I mean, I cannot comment on that, but that is a fact of the life, and that's the way it is. So that's the way I look at my patient from hepatology perspective. Let me see what Dr. Soin has to, give his thoughts.
So surgeons like to be like this very clear, symmetrical cut and paste, right? Because we like to see, we like
Yes.
laces with definite corners rather than just labyrinths with curves and rounds. You know what I mean? So alcohol is the same, probably rising a little bit. Hepatitis B is down, hepatitis C is down, NAFLD is right up. Sadly, cancer is going up.
Meant to talk about cancer, liver cancer. Just quickly, a couple of minutes, if you can spend on liver cancer, Dr. Soin as well.
And okay, liver cancer.
Yeah.
So liver cancer is very different from cancer of another or any other organ. Why? Because liver cancer has a clear precursor. That means a clear underlying condition on which the cancer happens. Liver cancer does not develop in a healthy liver. It usually develops in a diseased liver because of one of these four causes, which we've been talking about: hepatitis B, C, non-alcoholic liver, and alcoholic liver disease, and even other rarer causes like Wilson's disease, hemochromatosis, different things. So liver cancer actually affects an already affected liver. And what happens is that liver that has been affected by another disease or a virus tries to undergo, after the damage, it undergoes repair. And in this process of repair, there are some cells which are multiplying, and this kind of goes wrong. And then some of these cells become cancerous. So that's how liver cancer develops. And this is how it is different from any other. Why is it important to know this? Because if somebody has liver disease of any reason, of any cause, then there is a 20 to 25% chance that in their lifetime, they will develop a cancer. So they have to watch out. So somebody who has known liver disease must watch out for cancer. They must do something called alpha-fetoprotein and scans regularly every 6 months to 12 months to find out if they have cancer. So this is how screening of liver cancer can be done, because it usually develops on an underlying liver disease, which is known, usually known. Sometimes it's not known. So that's liver cancer.
It was meant to be an hour, but we have one or two questions. Do we have time for one or two questions more, Dr. Soin, Dr. Sehgal?
Okay.
Dr. Soin doesn't look very happy about the additional questions.
No, I'm very happy.
Okay, all right.
I have to pay my dues. I came late, so that's fine.
So what is the recidivism rate after liver transplant in alcoholics?
Right. We have a very, large experience on this.
Okay.
The figures in Western world are anywhere from 30 to 50%. That is people going to alcohol after liver transplant. In our country, we have published our paper on 2, 3 occasions. Our own experience of more than 450 liver transplants in alcohol liver disease. We found that the recidivism rate was about 12.5%, which is actually on the lower side.
It's on the low. I'm surprised. I would have thought it would be higher. Yeah?
Yes, but I have now realized that this was published about 3, 4 years back. We published in Alcohol. It's a very leading journal. Now we've seen that as the follow-up is increasing, the recidivism rate also increases. But still, the good point is that in our Indian society, when we are doing living donor transplants, just we have a donor in the family. It's a big family. The
Yeah.
family support is very strong, and the parents and all are staying together. So there's a
That helps. That
control.
helps. Yeah.
There's control on the
Yes.
patient
Yes.
in some way or the other. It does help. So luckily our follow-up is very good. The patient counseling is very good. We are having recidivism rate, which I mentioned about 12, 13%. The published figure, it could be a bit higher, but our rates are still lower than the rates you would see in Western world.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Soin, you would agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would have thought. I
And
would have
our,
expected
and
a
our,
higher
close,
figure.
our closely knit family unit
Really
and the
helps.
social structure actually helps.
Priyank wants to know what is the impact on liver post-heart transplant? What are the variations one can generally experience?
Uh,
So there is no direct effect of a heart or a lung transplant for that matter on the liver, right?
Yeah.
One can say that there occasionally can be side effects of the medicines that one is having for another transplant happening to the liver, which is called so-called drug-induced liver damage.
yes.
That occasionally happens with medicines like azathioprine, which used to be used in the past. They don't get used very often nowadays. Occasionally, steroids can result in liver damage, but it is not a question that one should be worried about. We hardly ever see it.
Piyush wants to know, do you recommend LCHF lifestyle? I don't know what that means. Under guidance of doctors for NAFLD.
Can you elaborate, please?
Do you recommend LCHF? I don't know. That's not been elaborated here. Lifestyle under guidance of doctors for NAFLD.
Not clear the question.
No. Okay. All right. One more question that we have is, Dr. Sehgal, has he used immunotherapy like lenvatinib and pembrolizumab therapy in HCC, and how is the outcome?
Yes, yes. I mean, we are using this lenvatinib in our HCC patients now. I mean, the thing is that those who are, difficult patients, we were initially using it for, those who are non-responders to the standard sorafenib, but now lenvatinib is coming more on the forefront. We are using it. Immunotherapy per se, we're not using much. It's more of a trial-based as part of clinical trial. And lenvatinib is thing which is among the, you can say, it's really getting the first line drug in HCC these days. We have a significant experience. It has its own side effects, but perhaps lesser than side effects than the earlier drugs. And the results are also perhaps better.
Dr. Shroff, are you here? Do you?
I am here, Pallavi. You're doing such a great job with two of my wonderful friends, So I didn't want to say anything.
Do you want to ask any
Hi,
question,
Sunil.
Dr.
Good to see you.
Hi. I just want to ask, Dr. Soin, you said about drugs. What about paracetamol? Occasionally we do see with paracetamol acute liver failure situation, don't we?
Yes, we do. And then paracetamol overdose can cause liver failure if it's more than a certain amount of dose, usually considered to be somewhere between 20 and 30 grams plus. And if it is taken all at once, then yes, it can cause liver failure.
Wow.
In lower dose, it is safe, relatively safe, right?
Yes, in the lower doses, up to the usual 4 to 6 grams a day. Nobody takes more than that. That's okay.
Other thing, which is actually worrying is also, some of the herbal medication, the Ayurvedic preparation,
Ayurvedic especially,
which are causing also liver toxicity without people realizing. And there's such a spurt of these medications. And now with COVID as well, everybody, is kind of climbing on the bandwagon to make a quick buck. So what is your opinion on that?
Sanjeev, you make a
Yes.
comment on that. That's a very
Yeah.
important question.
Yeah, I think Dr. Shroff, this is very important. And you know, unregulated herbal medications, sometimes you call them as desi medications, they can really have an hepatotoxic effect, and one should be very careful when you're taking them. See, the Indian age-old Ayurvedic medications, the practices, a lot of these, tulsi and cinnamon and all, they're very good. There's nothing wrong in that. Very good. But in the name of these drugs, sometimes you may be actually consuming something which are not safe for the liver. So you have to be very sure what is the source, what you're getting from which place. If you're doing something in your home, people are these days are having this kala and all for COVID. I'm sure it's a standard practice. But if you're having this, clear ingredients which are safe, there's nothing wrong. But otherwise, over-the-counter herbal drugs which have no clear ingredient mentioned, I would avoid them. I would recommend them. They're not safe for liver. We have seen, doctor, of many patients who have had liver toxicity because of these, so-called desi medications, and they should be kept in mind.
Does COVID itself have any effect on liver? I mean, just wondering.
Yeah, COVID can have, effect on liver because one of the receptors, the AC receptor on which it binds, it is present in the cholangiocytes, which is also there on the endothelial cells of the intestine. And it can have, a direct effect, which is called a direct toxicity, but that's not much. It can have immune-mediated liver damage, which is probably more common. It can have bystander hepatitis. And then COVID-related medications can also cause liver damage because the various drugs which are used, they can have some or the other side effects. Some of them are really much more, like tocilizumab, and it's probably much more than the others, which which are there. So there are at least 5, 6, 7 ways on which COVID can actually affect the liver. And one must be aware of all these when you're dealing with a COVID patient, especially. And then, those are very sick in ICU, they will have ischemic hepatitis and liver derangement. So you really have to be very careful and keep your eyes open and try and find out what is the cause of liver derangement, and then treat them accordingly.
Is there any medication which actually can help, now with when liver is a very, forgiving organ as well and it regenerates. So are there, of course, I'm sure there's research going on how to regenerate those cells, which are, especially in liver failure patients. But are there also any medications which are, available? And you did touch on things like statin, but does statin also prevent fatty liver by any chance? For people, many people today are taking statins, and fatty liver is also on rise. I mean, there are two questions really in what I'm asking you. One is about statin, and the other is any protective effect on liver. Somebody who has moderate liver failure, like milk thistle, many people take that, which again is not, a regulated medication.
I'll quickly answer that. Statins are safe in presence of fatty liver and dyslipidemia, which I mentioned earlier. But they are not recommended as a first-line treatment for treating fatty liver per se. So only if you have got deranged cholesterol, and then you want to use statin for the indication, you can use them under a supervised monitoring of a doctor. But you cannot use them with the premise that they're going to improve your fatty liver and prevent it from happening. That is not the recommendation today. For other drugs, like these, so there are a lot of regenerative medications. A lot of them are nutraceuticals actually, which are there in the market by various names. I don't want to discuss them right here. In fact, most of them have not stood the test of time, and they are not a recommended guideline. It's a magic thing, if you have a drug which can regenerate your liver, I think that is the ultimate, discovery in the field of hepatology and surgery, which we would like to have. But I don't think any of these like milk thistle or other Chinese medications or other drugs which are available actually, I don't think, Dr. Shroff, that they are recommended.
Chinese will anyway not use, no.
Yes, no.
Pallavi, with your permission, I'll ask one last question.
Sure, Dr. Shroff, yes.
So, Dr. Soin, as surgeons, we are very obsessive, of course, to help our patients, cure them, give them a good life, So in your kind of long career now, do you remember one or two cases which have really left a very lasting impact on you, the patients, from the patient's perspective?
So, I related one story of a child that I transplanted 22 odd years ago, and he's a strapping young lad of
Wow.
24 merely, and he's finished his internship. He wants to be a surgeon. Um, when I relate this story, and I must have related it 1,000 times, I still get goosebumps.
Yes,
Right?
I'm sure.
Because obviously, this is something very emotive. Over the years, he's been coming back. Of course, last 7-8 years, I've hardly seen him, but he's been coming back. We used to play initially with a ball, and then cricket, and then he
Wow.
obviously as he grew, this whole thing, obviously he grew out of one game and went to the other sport, and now he's of course a young man. So one was that, and then I must say that I have thousands of favorite patients, and all of them have such lovely stories. uh, there's another young lady who actually nearly died when she came to us. She was hypotensive, that means low blood pressure. She had a chest infection. She had grade 4 coma and liver failure. And I think she was 16 or 17 at the time. And Sanjeev and I both remember that case. Obviously, I won't name her.
Yes.
And she basically needed a transplant, but I think she was slightly too late for it. And her dad said that, I said that, if we transplant her now, maybe there's only 10-20% chance because, she's got hypertension, she's got chest infection. And these things are generally contraindications for doing a transplant. Her dad said, even if there is 1% chance, please take half my liver and just do it.
Wow.
And I don't remember actually having done such a high risk case ever. And, she got married 2 years ago.
Wow.
And she's doing absolutely great.
I am
And
getting goosebumps.
she keeps meeting Sanjeev and me.
Yes.
We have, like I said, I have many favorite cases.
Coming to your coming on this, exactly where we Jaya, who is a Harsalvikini recipient in Mumbai, has formed a patient support group called Triumph, in Bombay. So do you think that there is an opportunity for these patients to promote organ donation, help the whole cause of the whole ecosystem of organ donation in this country, like a patient support group, which is so strong overseas, in whether it's England or US, whereas in India, it's very fragmented. So Jaya has taken this initiative in Mumbai, and hopefully...
Sudhir has taken this initiative, of course, Sudhir Devan.
Yeah, of course.
Sudhir, are you still there? I don't know.
Yeah, of course
He'll be there on the Facebook.
Yeah. So he's there, and I know many people. Anil Suchak has taken this up. And,
so what we need is a very cohesive group from all over, together.
So there is a patient called Ratan who
ran in the transplant games.
Who ran in the transplant games. His wife was a donor. They had a child 3 years after they had the transplant. And he is a huge promoter of organ donation.
Yes.
So the simple answer is yes, we should make it into an organized effort. I agree with that, So not just as a patient support group for future patients, but also for organ donation specifically.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. There are many other questions, but we'll have to end since we're running out of time. Dr. Sumana wanted a link to your paper on recidivism, so I hopefully you'll share that link on the article, and I'll share it with her.
Yeah. I can share that easily, and which is fine. It's in alcohol. I'll share it to you.
Really hoping that nobody would ask questions and we would have time, and we'll ask Dr. Sehgal to sing for us, but that didn't happen. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Sehgal.
I cannot sing, but I'll give you one ABCD of liver and how to keep liver healthy. Like
perfect.
While Dr. Soin was speaking, I was thinking of something it came to my mind. The 7 steps of healthy liver. Okay. So it's A, B, C, E, F, G, right? So let me tell you right that. So A is about alcohol. B, have a balanced diet. C, control diabetes, cholesterol, blood pressure. D, drugs, as Dr. Shroff mentioned, avoid drugs and toxins, over-the-counter medications, painkillers, and herbal drugs. E, exercise, self-explanatory, do exercise. F, follow up with your doctor. Especially if you've been told to have a fatty liver or hepatitis B or C, it's mandatory. Please go to your doctor, annual checkup, 6-monthly checkup, 3-monthly checkup. Don't ignore it. Just follow up. And G, get vaccinated against hepatitis B. If you do that, then with 95 to 99% protection you'll get against hepatitis B if you've got 3 doses of hepatitis B vaccine. So essentially, if you follow this, 7 steps, which I think are the 7 pearls of keeping liver
Very
healthy,
nice.
I think you can take care of the liver very well.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Soin. Thank you so much, Dr. Sehgal, for being with us. And thank you also for your continued support to the foundation, to the cause of organ donation. We feel very, very strengthened by that support and guidance. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Pallavi, and great to be with you. And I really enjoyed this session. And I hope the people who were with us enjoyed it equally. Thank you, Sunil and Pallavi, for creating and taking Mohan Foundation ahead to where it has gone and taking organ donation as such a passionate cause, which obviously saves thousands of lives. So, Sanjeev, thank you also.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's
Thank
wonderful
you.
being with you all. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.